While Colonel Nathaniel Beaumont and his family celebrated Thanksgiving Day of 1853 in their imposing two-story mansion in Brazos County, Texas, laughing and sharing stories of prosperity about the 5,000 acres of cotton that enriched them, no one noticed the enslaved woman in the kitchen carefully pouring a fine, odorless powder into the roasted turkey platter. Her name was Ruth Carter. She was 34 years old, mother of 3 children, and that afternoon of November 24th, she would transform a family banquet into one of the most brutal mass poisonings in the history of Texas slavery. But the poison wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a 6-month psychological terror campaign that would drive away all white farmers within a 20-mile radius, abandoning their plantations as if fleeing from the devil himself. This is the story of how an enslaved mother used the deaths of 9 white men to create a territory of freedom where the law didn't have the courage to tread. It all began 7 months earlier, on the morning of April 15, 1853, when Colonel Beaumont decided that Ruth needed to be tamed, and chose to do it in front of her 3 children, Thomas, 12 years old, Sarah, 9, and little Grace, only 6. What happened that morning in the barn wasn't just rape. It was a calculated demonstration of absolute power. A deliberate lesson taught to enslaved children about what their bodies meant to the white men who owned them. Thomas, forced to hold his mother's hands while she screamed. Sarah and Grace, compelled to watch every second, every tear, every plea ignored. And when it was over, the colonel simply adjusted his trousers, nodded to the overseer, and ordered everyone back to work, as if he hadn't just destroyed an entire family before their own eyes. But Ruth Carter was no ordinary woman. Daughter of an Ashanti healer captured at 15, she had inherited ancestral knowledge about herbs, poisons, and the psychological power of fear. And that morning, as her children helped her rise from the dirty barn floor, something inside her didn't just break, it transformed. In her eyes, a coldness was born that would never leave her. Over the next 6 months, Ruth Carter wouldn't just plan the deaths of 9 white men. She would orchestrate a terror campaign so effective that by the summer of 1854, farmers throughout Brazos County would be selling their lands for pennies, fleeing to Houston or San Antonio, whispering stories about the ghost woman's curse that killed white men who abused enslaved women. Thanksgiving Day would be only the first act. 9 men poisoned at a festive dinner, including Colonel Beaumont, his son Edmund, Overseer McAllister, 2 drivers, and 4 visiting farmers from neighboring plantations. But the deaths weren't quick. The poison chosen by Ruth, a mixture of oleander, castor beans, and water hemlock, guaranteed 6 to 8 hours of agony. Enough time for everyone in Brazos County to know exactly what was happening. Enough time for the farmers' wives and daughters to watch their husbands and fathers vomiting blood, convulsing, begging for mercy that wouldn't come. And when investigators tried to blame Ruth, they discovered something disturbing. She had a perfect alibi for each death because she wasn't killing alone. She was coordinating a secret network of domestic enslaved women across 10 different plantations. December brought 2 more deaths, this time by accidents. The new overseer hired to replace McAllister found drowned in the creek with lungs full of muddy water. The colonel's younger brother, who took over the farm, stepping on a rotten barn board that sent him plummeting 15 feet to break his neck. Accidents or the curse? January 1854 saw 3 neighboring farmers mysteriously poisoned, each of them known for abusing enslaved women. February brought unexplained fires in 3 barns, always at midnight, always starting from within, always impossible to extinguish in time. March, 2 more white men found dead with foam coming from their mouths, glassy eyes, expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. And through it all, Ruth Carter remained perfectly visible, cooking, cleaning, caring for her children, singing spirituals softly as she worked. When investigators interrogated her, She looked with empty eyes and answered in monosyllables. When they tried to torture her into confessing, they discovered that each threat resulted in another mysterious death. A white investigator suffocated in his sleep, another found with his throat cut, a third simply vanished, his horse returning alone with reins covered in blood. By June 1854, 15 months after the rape in the barn, Brazos County was a territory of white terror. 27 farmers had sold their lands and fled. The remaining plantations operated with half the overseers needed. No one wanted the job. Slave patrollers refused to enter the properties after sunset, and whispers ran through the slave quarters of 10 counties. Ruth Carter broke the fear. If one mother can do this, what can't we do? This is the story of how an enslaved woman not only avenged her own violated body and the stolen innocence of her children, but transformed trauma into power, pain into strategy, and an act of sexual brutality into a silent revolution that redrew the map of terror in slaveholding Texas. Ruth Carter arrived at Beaumont Plantation in the spring of 1838. Purchased at a New Orleans slave auction for $800, a high price that reflected both her youth, 15 years old, and her mother's reputation as a skilled healer. Colonel Nathaniel Beaumont, 32 at the time, had just inherited 3,000 acres in Brazos County from his father and was building his cotton empire with methodical ambition. He needed house slaves who could cook, clean, and tend to the medical needs of his growing workforce. Ruth's mother, Adana, an Ashanti woman with knowledge of hundreds of medicinal and poisonous plants, had been the primary attraction. Ruth came as part of the package. Adana taught her daughter everything in those first 3 years at Beaumont Plantation. Not just which herbs healed, comfrey for wounds, willow bark for fever, mint for digestion, but which ones killed. Oleander, beautiful with pink flowers, every part deadly. Water hemlock, growing wild along Texas creeks, causing violent convulsions. Jimson weed, with trumpet-shaped flowers, inducing hallucinations and respiratory failure. Pokeweed berries, tempting and purple, shutting down organs slowly. Castor beans, pressed for oil but deadly when chewed whole. Foxglove, affecting the heart with precision. Knowledge is the only thing they cannot take from you, Adana whispered during those stolen moments in the quarters after the day's work ended. They own your body, child, but your mind can be free, and a free mind is dangerous. Ruth absorbed everything. She learned to identify plants by leaf, stem, root, and flower. She learned dosages, how much to heal, how much to harm, how much to kill. She learned timing, which poisons acted fast, which slow, which left traces, which disappeared. She learned symptoms, what convulsions looked like versus heart failure, what poisoning resembled compared to natural illness. Her mother made her repeat everything until it became instinct. Adana died in 1841, her body simply giving out after 6 years of slavery's brutality. Ruth was 18, alone and terrified, but she had the knowledge, and she had learned something else from her mother. How to be invisible, how to move through the big house like a shadow, how to keep eyes downcast but ears sharp, how to appear simple while understanding everything, how to be the slave they wanted to see while remaining someone entirely different inside. The same year her mother died, Ruth caught the attention of a field hand named Isaiah. He was 22, born in Virginia, sold south at 17 when his master died, and the estate was liquidated. Isaiah had kind eyes and gentle hands, rare qualities in a world designed to crush gentleness. They married in the slave tradition, jumping the broom in front of the quarters community, knowing their union had no legal standing, but treasuring it nonetheless. Colonel Beaumont allowed the marriage because it increased his property value. Enslaved people who formed families were less likely to run, more invested in staying, and their children would be his property from birth. Thomas was born in 1841, delivered by Ruth's own hands, with the help of elderly Aunt Dinah from the quarters. Sarah followed in 1844. Grace arrived in 1847. 3 children, born into bondage, their futures predetermined before their first breath. But Ruth poured everything into them. She taught them to read in secret, using a tattered Bible she'd hidden for years. She taught them their African heritage, whispering stories Adana had told her about the Ashanti kingdom, about warriors and queens, and people who had never known chains. She taught them the plant knowledge, carefully, selectively, knowing it might be the only weapon they'd ever have. Isaiah worked the cotton fields, his body breaking slowly under the Texas sun and the overseer's demands. But he came home every night to his family, and for Ruth, those moments in the quarters, the 4 of them together, Thomas reading to his sisters, Isaiah singing work songs in his deep voice, Ruth preparing meals from the meager rations. Those moments were everything. They were proof that love could survive even in hell, that humanity persisted despite every attempt to destroy it. Beaumont Plantation in 1853 was one of the largest cotton operations in Brazos County. 5,000 acres stretching along the Brazos River, worked by 230 enslaved people. The big house stood on a hill overlooking the fields, a 2-story Greek Revival mansion with white columns and sprawling verandas, a monument to wealth built on stolen labor and stolen lives. Behind it, the quarters stretched in long rows, crude wooden cabins housing 5 to 7 people each, with dirt floors, gaps in the walls, and roofs that leaked when it rained. Colonel Nathaniel Beaumont was 57 in 1853, a tall man with iron-grey hair and cold blue eyes that never wavered when he gave orders. He'd expanded his father's modest operation into an empire worth over $200,000. He owned 230 human beings, evaluated and listed in his ledgers like livestock. Ruth, house slave, female, 34 years, good health, cooking and medical skills, value $900. Thomas, field hand male, 12 years, strong build, value $600. Sarah, house girl, female, 9 years, quick learner, value $500. His wife, Constance Beaumont, was 49, a thin woman with a permanent expression of displeasure. She'd given the colonel 3 children, Edmund, 28, who helped manage the plantation, Catherine, 25, married off to a Houston merchant, and Margaret, 22, still living at home and desperately seeking a suitable husband. Constance ran the household with rigid efficiency, supervising the house slaves' every movement, quick with slaps and verbal abuse, slower to acknowledge competent work. Edmund Beaumont had inherited his father's cold eyes, but added his own particular cruelty. He'd attended school in Charleston, returned with ideas about slave management that made even the overseers uncomfortable. He believed in breaking slaves young, teaching them their place through systematic humiliation and violence. He particularly enjoyed targeting families, understanding that hurting one member destroyed them all. The overseer, Jacob McAllister, was a transplant from Georgia, 43 years old, face weathered like leather from decades in the sun. He'd made his reputation managing difficult plantations, which meant he had no qualms about violence. He carried a whip always, used it freely, and kept detailed records of every infraction and punishment. Under his watch, Beaumont Plantation ran with brutal efficiency. Slaves who slowed down were whipped. Slaves who talked back were starved. Slaves who ran were hunted down, returned, and made examples of in front of the entire workforce. The 2 drivers, Moses and Jeremiah, occupied that impossible position between the enslaved and the enslavers. Both were born on the plantation. Both had risen to their positions by demonstrating absolute loyalty to white authority. Both understood their survival depended on being harsher to their own people than any white man would be. Moses was 37, father of 6, hated and pitied in equal measure. Jeremiah was 42, childless, having seen his wife sold away years before, now married only to his position of petty power. This was Ruth's world, a world where she cooked every meal for the Beaumont family, where she tended to Mistress Constance's headaches and Edmund's hangovers, where she cleaned and scrubbed and served and remained silent while they discussed her and her children as if they weren't human. A world where her husband left before dawn and returned after dark, back scarred from years of whippings, hands calloused and bleeding from cotton bowls. A world where her children were taught to be invisible, to never look white people in the eye, to accept their station without question. But Ruth had her mother's knowledge hidden in her mind, and she had something else now. After 15 years of watching, learning, understanding the rhythms and routines of her oppressors, she knew exactly how the big house operated. She knew which foods the colonel preferred, which wines, which times of day he was most drunk and careless. She knew Mistress Constance's medicine schedule, Edmund's hunting trips, which neighbours visited when. She knew where the overseers slept, their habits, their weaknesses. She knew, if she ever needed to, exactly how to destroy them all. The morning of April 15th, 1853, began like any other. Ruth woke before dawn in the small cabin she shared with Isaiah and their 3 children. The space was cramped, 2 wooden pallets on the dirt floor, a small table, 1 chair, hooks on the wall for the few clothes they owned. But it was theirs, the only private space they'd ever known. Isaiah had already left for the fields. During cotton season, field hands worked from can see to can't see. First light until darkness made further work impossible. Ruth prepared a breakfast of cornmeal mush for the children, rationing their weekly allowance of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses. Thomas ate quickly, knowing he'd be expected in the fields soon, despite being only 12. Sarah helped her mother, already learning the domestic skills that would determine her value. Grace, at 6, still had a few years before she'd be put to full work, but she was learning too, watching everything with solemn eyes that seemed far too old for her age. Ruth walked to the big house through the morning mist, Thomas and Sarah behind her. Thomas would split off to join the field gangs. Sarah would help Ruth in the house. Grace stayed in the quarters with the other small children, supervised by elderly women too old for field work. The big house was stirring. Ruth entered through the back door, into the kitchen that had been her domain for 15 years. She started the fire in the massive cast-iron stove, began preparing breakfast for the Beaumont family. Biscuits from scratch, ham sliced thick, eggs scrambled, coffee brewed strong, grits cooked with butter. Everything precise, everything perfect, because anything less meant punishment. Mistress Constance came down first, as always, inspecting Ruth's work with critical eyes. "The biscuits are uneven," she said, picking one apart. "You're getting careless, Ruth. Perhaps you need a reminder about the quality I expect." "Yes, ma'am," Ruth said, eyes down. The biscuits were perfect, as they always were, but Mistress Constance needed to find fault. It was her way of asserting control, reminding Ruth of her place before the day even began. Colonel Beaumont descended next, settling at the dining table with his newspaper. Edmund followed, smelling of bourbon even at this early hour. Ruth served them, moving silently, filling plates, pouring coffee, becoming invisible as she'd learned to do. "Cotton prices are holding," the colonel said, scanning the financial pages. "If this weather holds, we'll have our best year yet. We'll clear $30,000 easily." "We should expand," Edmund said. "The Henderson's plantation to the south, they're struggling. We could buy them out cheap, add another 1,000 acres." "Maybe," the colonel said, "but we'd need more hands. The breeding program needs to accelerate." They discussed human beings like livestock, which enslaved women were good breeders, which men had the strongest children, how many pregnancies they could expect this year, how much each child would add to their wealth. Ruth stood in the corner, holding the coffee pot, listening to them calculate the value of babies not yet born. After breakfast, Ruth cleaned, She washed dishes, scrubbed floors, dusted furniture, changed linens. Sarah helped, learning the routines. They worked in silence mostly, but occasionally Ruth would teach her daughter something. See how the silver tarnishes. You polish it like this in small circles. They notice everything, so you make sure nothing is wrong. Give them no excuse. Mid-morning, Edmund found Ruth in the parlor, polishing the wooden sideboard. "Ruth," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that made her stomach clench. "Father wants to see you in the barn. Now." Ruth's heart began to race. The barn was where punishments happened, away from the house, away from witnesses who mattered. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Bring the children," Edmund added. "Thomas and Sarah. Father wants them there too." Now Ruth's blood went cold. Whatever was about to happen, it was designed to terrorize her children as well as her. She found Thomas hauling water near the well, Sarah in the kitchen cleaning vegetables. "Come with me," she told them softly. "Stay close. No matter what happens, stay quiet." They walked to the barn, a large structure that housed horses, equipment, and served as the site for countless horrors over the years. Inside, the air smelled of hay and leather and old blood. Colonel Beaumont was waiting, along with Overseer McAllister. Edmund entered behind Ruth and the children, closing the barn door. "Ruth," the colonel began, his voice conversational, "you've been with us for 15 years now. You were purchased as a girl. You've grown into a woman here. You've had children here. This plantation is the only home you know." "Yes, sir," Ruth said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "And in those 15 years, you've been well treated, fed, clothed, given medical care. Your husband has never been sold away. Your children remain with you. Do you understand how fortunate that makes you?" "Yes, sir. Some slaves forget their place." "My dear," the colonel continued, "they begin to think too highly of themselves. They need reminders about what they are. Property, nothing more." Ruth said nothing. Her children stood behind her, Thomas gripping Sarah's hand. "Edmund tells me he saw your boy with a book yesterday," the colonel said. "Reading. Who taught him to read, Ruth?" The question hung in the air. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Texas, punishable by severe penalty. Ruth had been so careful, teaching Thomas only in secret, only at night, only with the tattered Bible she'd hidden for years. "I don't know, sir," Ruth said quietly. "You don't know?" The colonel's voice hardened. "Your son learns to read, and you don't know how. You think I'm a fool, Ruth?" "No, sir. Someone taught that boy, and I suspect it was you, which means you've been breaking the law under my roof, corrupting my property, giving slaves ideas above their station." "Sir, Quiet." The colonel moved closer. "You need to remember what you are, and your children need to learn early what they are, so they don't make the same mistakes you have." He nodded to McAllister. The overseer grabbed Ruth's arms, yanking them behind her back. She didn't struggle. Struggling would make it worse. But she felt her children tense behind her, heard Sarah's small gasp of fear. "Thomas," the colonel said, "come here, boy." Thomas didn't move. He was 12, tall for his age, but still just a child. His eyes were wide with terror. "I said, come here." The colonel's voice cracked like a whip. Thomas moved forward on trembling legs. "Hold your mother's hands," the colonel commanded. "That's right. Hold them tight. Don't let go no matter what you hear." Ruth felt her son's hands grip hers from behind, felt them shaking. "It's all right, baby," she whispered. "It's all right." "Sarah, Grace," the colonel said, "you stand right there. You watch. You learn. This is what happens when property forgets its place." What happened next shattered everything Ruth had ever known about endurance, about survival, about the limits of human cruelty. The colonel raped her in that barn, on the hay-covered floor, while her son held her hands and her daughters watched. He took his time, ensuring maximum humiliation, maximum psychological damage to all of them. When Ruth cried out, he told Thomas to hold tighter. When Sarah tried to turn away, Edmund grabbed her head and forced her to watch. When Grace began sobbing, McAllister slapped her hard enough to knock her down. The physical pain was immense, but the psychological destruction was worse. Ruth could hear Thomas behind her crying silently, his tears falling on her arms. She could see Sarah's face, frozen in horror, innocence dying in real time. She could hear Grace's terrified whimpering, and she understood with absolute clarity that this wasn't just about violating her body. This was about destroying her children's souls, about teaching them that their mother couldn't protect them, that their bodies weren't their own, that no boundary was sacred, that no horror was beyond what could be done to them. When the colonel finished, he stood, adjusted his clothing, and looked down at Ruth, lying broken on the barn floor. "That," he said calmly, "is what you are. That's what your children are, property, tools, animals, and if I ever hear about Reading again, I'll sell all 3 of these children so far south you'll never see them again. Understood?" Ruth couldn't speak. Her throat had closed with pain and rage and something darker than either. "I asked if you understood," the colonel repeated. "Yes," Ruth whispered. "Sir." "Good. Clean yourself up, get back to work, and remember this lesson, Ruth. Remember it well." They left her there. Thomas, Sarah and Grace gathered around her, trying to help her stand, their faces wet with tears, their hands gentle but useless against the magnitude of what had just happened. Ruth let them help her sit up. She looked at each of her children's faces and saw what she'd most feared to see, the moment their childhoods ended, the moment they truly understood what slavery meant, what it would always mean. Thomas's eyes held a rage that terrified her, a rage that would get him killed if he didn't learn to hide it. Sarah's face showed betrayal. "Why couldn't you protect yourself, Mama? Why couldn't you protect us?" Grace, youngest and most damaged, had gone somewhere else entirely, her eyes glassy and distant, already learning to dissociate from horror too great to process. Ruth made herself stand. Her body screamed, blood ran down her legs, but she stood because staying down meant death, meant surrender, meant they'd won completely. She held her children, all 3 of them, in a desperate embrace in that awful barn. "Listen to me," she whispered, voice hoarse. "Listen carefully. What happened today, this doesn't break us. You hear me? This doesn't break us. They can hurt our bodies, but they can't have our souls. We survive, we endure. And someday we'll be free." But even as she said the words, Ruth knew something fundamental had shifted. Something inside her had died in that barn. And something else, something cold and calculating and absolutely merciless, had been born. She'd spent 15 years surviving slavery by being obedient, by being useful, by making herself valuable. She'd believed that if she worked hard enough, caused no trouble, gave them no reason for cruelty, maybe her children could have some semblance of childhood. Maybe they could be spared the worst of it. That belief died in the barn. The colonel had shown her that no amount of obedience would protect them, that her children would be violated and brutalized simply because they could be, simply because demonstrating power required victims. She'd been naive to think otherwise. That afternoon, Ruth cleaned herself as best she could, changed her clothes, and returned to the big house to prepare dinner. She moved mechanically, her body present, but her mind somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark and cold, where a new kind of thoughts were beginning to form. Thoughts about oleander growing by the creek, about castor beans in the slave garden, about water hemlock in the marshy ground near the river, about foxglove she'd seen on the edges of the property. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Knowledge is the only thing they cannot take from you." That night, Ruth lay on the pallet next to Isaiah, unable to sleep, unable to speak about what had happened. Her husband knew something terrible had occurred. The children's faces told that story, but Ruth couldn't form the words. How do you tell your husband that you were raped while your son held your hands? How do you speak that particular horror aloud? Instead, she lay awake, staring at the rough wooden ceiling, listening to her children's restless sleep, and began to plan. Not escape. Escape was nearly impossible with 3 children, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. Not resistance through small acts of sabotage. Those were meaningless against the enormity of what had been done to them. No, what Ruth began planning that night was something far more absolute, something that would require months of preparation, perfect timing, absolute control over her emotions, and a willingness to cross lines that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. She began planning death, not just the Colonel's death, though his would be first and worst, not just Edmund's, though he'd directed the whole horror, but systematic, methodical, terrifying death for everyone who'd participated, everyone who'd enabled, everyone who thought they could destroy her family without consequence. Ruth Carter had been property for 15 years. That ended the morning of April 15th. What lay in that cabin now, staring at the ceiling while her children whimpered in their sleep, was something the Colonel and his kind had never anticipated. An enslaved woman with extensive knowledge of poisons, intimate access to their food, absolute clarity about their routines, and nothing left to lose. The planning began immediately. Ruth knew she couldn't rush. Hasty revenge would only get her killed and leave her children even more vulnerable. She needed time, months, probably. Time to gather materials, establish alibis, coordinate with others if possible, and most critically, time to ensure that when she struck so completely that there would be no retaliation against her children. The first step was observation. Ruth had been watching her oppressors for 15 years, but now she watched with different eyes, predator's eyes. She tracked the Colonel's daily routine down to the minute. Breakfast at 6:30, coffee first, always coffee, 3 cups before he touched food, then to his study for an hour reviewing accounts, morning inspection of the fields at 8, return to the house at noon for dinner, afternoons spent with neighbors or tending to business, evening meal at 6, bourbon in the study afterward, sometimes alone, sometimes with Edmund or visiting farmers. Bed by 9. Edmund's schedule was less rigid, but equally trackable. He drank heavily, starting in the morning and continuing through the day. He rode the property boundaries every afternoon, checking fences and slave work gangs. He visited the quarters at night sometimes, selecting women, dragging them to the barn. Everyone knew. No one could stop it. Overseer McAllister was up before dawn, in the fields all day, ate dinner in his small house near the quarters, drank himself to sleep by 8. The drivers, Moses and Jeremiah, worked the field gangs from dawn to dusk, ate in the quarters, had no privacy and no power once the white men retired for the night. Ruth also observed the Beaumont family's social calendar. They entertained frequently, dinner parties with neighboring planters, political gatherings, church functions. The Colonel hosted a particularly large gathering every Thanksgiving, inviting his closest associates, showing off his wealth and success. 20 to 30 guests, elaborate meals prepared over days. Ruth and the other house slaves working themselves to exhaustion to meet the Colonel's exacting standards. Thanksgiving, that would be the moment, 7 months away, enough time to prepare. And the perfect opportunity, multiple targets in one place, food preparation entirely under Ruth's control, chaos and panic that would obscure evidence. The second step was gathering materials. Ruth began with oleander. The shrub grew prolifically along the creek that ran through the eastern edge of the property. Beautiful pink flowers, thick green leaves, every part deadly. One leaf, chewed and swallowed, could kill an adult. Ruth began collecting leaves during her rare free moments, drying them carefully, grinding them to powder, storing the powder in a hidden tin buried beneath the cabin floor. Castor beans came from the slave garden. Many plantations grew castor plants for the oil, useful for lamp fuel and medicinal purposes when properly processed. But the beans themselves, if chewed, released ricin, one of the most deadly poisons nature produced. 3 beans could kill a grown man. Ruth collected them methodically, a few at a time, crushing them to paste, letting the paste dry, reducing it to fine powder. Water hemlock grew in the marshy areas near the Brazos River. Roots that looked innocuous but contained cicutoxin, causing violent seizures and respiratory failure within hours. Ruth harvested them carefully, always wearing cloth around her hands because even touching the broken roots could cause skin poisoning. She dried them, ground them, added them to her collection. Pokeweed berries were everywhere. The plant was considered a nuisance, growing wild in disturbed soil. The berries looked like blackberries, tempting and purple, but eating even a handful caused severe poisoning. Ruth collected them in late summer, mashed them, extracted the juice, concentrated it through careful heating, reduced it to a syrupy poison that mixed invisibly with red wine or dark gravy. Foxglove grew near the big house. Mistress Constance had planted it years ago for its beautiful purple flowers, never knowing or caring that every part contained digitalis, a compound that affected the heart. Too much would cause cardiac arrest. Ruth snipped flowers and leaves when she was supposed to be weeding the garden, dried them, powdered them, added them to her arsenal. Over 6 months, Ruth accumulated enough poison to kill 50 people. She stored everything in multiple locations, some buried under the cabin, some hidden in the rafters, some secreted in the big house kitchen itself. In tins marked as common spices. She tested small amounts on rats first, then on chickens, carefully observing symptoms, timing deaths, perfecting dosages. The third step was psychological preparation. Ruth needed to become 2 people. The Ruth everyone saw, obedient, subservient, broken by what had happened in April, and the real Ruth hidden deep inside, cold and calculating and absolutely committed to what was coming. She played the role perfectly. She moved through the big house like a ghost, anticipating needs, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when spoken to. When the colonel looked at her, she made sure he saw defeat in her face. When Edmund passed her in the hallway, she made herself small and frightened. When Mistress Constance criticized her work, she apologized immediately and corrected whatever imaginary flaw had been identified. But at night, in the cabin, Ruth taught her children differently. She couldn't tell them the specifics of her plan. Thomas was only 12 and might not be able to hide his knowledge. Sarah was 9 and too innocent to carry such a burden. Grace was 6 and still recovering from trauma, but she could teach them strength. What happened in April, Ruth told them one night when Isaiah was still in the fields, that was evil, pure evil. And you need to understand something important. Evil like that doesn't go unpunished forever. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But justice comes. You believe that? Yes, Mama, Thomas said, though his eyes held doubt. And another thing, Ruth continued, you're not what they say you are. You're not property. You're not animals. You're human beings, children of God, descendants of kings and queens in Africa. They can own your body for now, but they don't own your soul. Never forget that. She also began teaching them survival skills they'd need for what would come after Thanksgiving. How to navigate by the North Star, how to move quietly through the woods, how to tell edible plants from poisonous ones, how to hide tracks, how to stay calm when terrified. She framed it as general knowledge, but she was preparing them for flight. Isaiah knew something had changed in his wife, but not the specifics. Ruth loved him too much to burden him with knowledge that could get him killed. If investigators ever questioned him, his genuine ignorance might save his life, so she simply held him at night, memorized the feeling of his arms around her, and accepted that what she was planning might mean she'd never feel safe with him again. The fourth step was identifying allies. Ruth couldn't do everything alone. She'd need help coordinating timing, creating alibis, potentially even directly participating in certain deaths. But recruiting was dangerous. Choose the wrong person, and the entire plan collapsed. Ruth chose carefully. First, she approached Dinah, the elderly woman who delivered all three of Ruth's children. Dinah was 68, had been enslaved for 50 years, had seen every horror imaginable, and survived by being shrewd and silent. Ruth found her one afternoon in the quarters, helping with laundry. "Aunt Dinah," Ruth said quietly, "I need to tell you something, but if you don't want to hear it, say so now and we never speak of it again." Dinah looked at Ruth with ancient, knowing eyes. "Child, you got that look your mama had before she died, like she'd seen to the other side and wasn't afraid anymore. What you planning?" "Thanksgiving," Ruth said simply. "The Colonel's dinner party. 9 men, maybe more." Dinah was silent for a long moment. Then, "What you need from me?" "Alibi. When it happens, I need witnesses that I was never alone with the food. That someone was with me every moment, that there was no opportunity." "You got it," Dinah said. "And child, what happened in that barn in April? That wasn't right at all. Whatever you're planning, you got my blessing." The second ally was Esther, a 32-year-old enslaved woman who cooked for the Henderson plantation to the south. Ruth encountered her at the Sunday church service that enslaved people from multiple plantations attended together. They spoke in whispers while pretending to pray. "I know what Colonel Beaumont did to you," Esther said. "Everyone knows. These men think we don't talk, but we talk. We see everything." "Do you want things to change?" Ruth asked. "Change? How? We're slaves. Change doesn't come for us." "It could," Ruth said. "If enough of them died, if enough of them were afraid, it could." Esther studied Ruth's face. "What are you asking?" "The Henderson plantation. You cook there. I'm planning something for Thanksgiving. The Hendersons will be at Colonel Beaumont's dinner. If they eat what I prepare, they'll die. I need to know you won't try to stop it. And I need to know if there are others like us, on other plantations, who might do the same." The risk of this conversation was immense, but Esther surprised Ruth by smiling, a hard, bitter smile with no humor in it. "They killed my son last year," she said. "Whipped him to death for running. He was 14, so yes, Ruth, you do what you're planning, and I'll do my part. There are others too. Women who've lost children, lost husbands, been violated themselves. You're not alone." Over the next months, Ruth carefully, cautiously built a network. 6 enslaved women across 5 plantations, all cooking in big houses, all with access to their master's food, all with reasons for rage that ran soul deep. They developed simple signals. A particular hymn sung at church meant a meeting was needed. A certain flower left at a particular spot indicated readiness. They shared knowledge about poisons, about alibis, about how to target the men most responsible for brutality. What Ruth was creating wasn't just a murder plot. It was the beginning of something larger, a coordinated resistance that used the very domesticity that enslaved them as a weapon. They were cooks, so they controlled food. They were nurses, so they controlled medicine. They were invisible in white spaces, so they saw everything, and they were dismissed as simple and incapable, so no one suspected the intelligence and organization developing right under their oppressors' noses. The 5th step was finalizing the details. Thanksgiving would be November 24th, 1853. The guest list was predictable. The Colonel invited the same people every year, confirmed attendees: Colonel Beaumont, his wife Constance, his son Edmund, Mr. Henderson and his wife from the neighboring plantation, Mr. Whitfield, a prosperous planter from 20 miles south, Mr. Caldwell, who owned a smaller operation to the east, Mr. Thornton and his wife, cotton merchants from Houston, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, recent transplants from Alabama, and several other planters and merchants, 15 to 20 people total. The menu was equally predictable because Mistress Constance insisted on the same Thanksgiving meal every year: roast turkey with oyster stuffing, baked ham, corn pudding, sweet potatoes with molasses, collard greens, cornbread, pickled vegetables, pumpkin pie, pecan pie, sweet potato pie, and copious amounts of wine, bourbon, and cider. Ruth had multiple opportunities to introduce poison. The turkey would be basted repeatedly. Poison in the basting liquid would permeate the meat. The gravy would be rich and dark, perfect for masking the pokeweed extract. The wine would flow freely. Foxglove powder dissolved invisibly in red wine. The pies would have complex spiced flavors. Oleander and castor bean powder mixed with cinnamon and nutmeg would be undetectable until too late. But Ruth planned even more carefully than that. She would dose different dishes with different poisons, ensuring varied symptoms and staggered timing. Some guests would fall ill immediately, others within hours. This would create maximum chaos, prevent anyone from identifying the specific source, and ensure that even if some food was avoided, enough people would still consume lethal doses. She also planned redundancy. If somehow the food poisoning failed, she had backup plans. She would handle all the coffee service that evening. Poison in the coffee was a failsafe. She would prepare the bourbon decanters in the Colonel's study. Poison there would catch anyone who survived dinner. She would even poison the water pitchers in the guest bedrooms, a final trap for anyone who made it through the night but was still in the house the next morning. The sixth step was emotional preparation for consequences. Ruth understood perfectly what would follow if her plan succeeded. If 9 white people died suddenly during Thanksgiving dinner, investigations would be thorough and brutal. Enslaved people would be interrogated, tortured, executed on suspicion alone. The entire enslaved population of Brazos County would suffer collective punishment. Ruth made peace with this. She couldn't save everyone, but she could create an example so dramatic, so terrifying, that it fundamentally changed the calculus of power. When slave owners had to fear their cooks, when they couldn't trust the food in their own homes, when they understood that violence against enslaved people might result in their own deaths, that fear was worth the cost. Ruth also prepared for her own likely death. The alibi would help, but might not save her. She might be executed on suspicion. She might be sold south. She might be tortured until she confessed. She accepted all of this. What mattered was that her children would see justice done. They'd see that what happened in April wasn't the end, that their mother fought back, that she chose death with dignity over life in submission. She wrote no confession, left no evidence, but she spoke to her children one final time, the night before Thanksgiving. Isaiah had already fallen asleep, exhausted from the fields. Ruth gathered Thomas, Sarah, and Grace close. "Tomorrow something's going to happen," she told them quietly. "Something big. I can't tell you exactly what, but afterward things are going to be very different. There might be chaos. There might be danger. I need you 3 to stay together no matter what, protect each other, and remember everything I've taught you." "Mama, what are you going to do?" Thomas asked. At 12, he was old enough to understand subtext, to see the finality in his mother's eyes. "I'm going to make sure what happened in April never happens to anyone else," Ruth said. "That's all you need to know. And Thomas, if something happens to me, you become the head of this family. You protect your sisters. You stay strong. You don't let anger make you foolish. You survive, and someday you get free, understand? Mama. Understand?" "Yes, Mama," Thomas whispered. Ruth held her children, all 3 of them, as tightly as she could. She memorized the feel of their bodies, the smell of their hair, the sound of their breathing. Tomorrow they might be orphans. Tomorrow they might watch her die. But they'd also see that slavery didn't make their mother helpless, that love could inspire courage, that resistance was possible even from the most powerless position imaginable. "I love you," Ruth told them, "more than anything in this world or the next, And whatever happens tomorrow, you remember that. Remember that love is stronger than chains. Remember that we fought. Remember that we didn't just endure, we resisted. Can you remember that?" "Yes, Mama," they answered together. "Good. Now go to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a very long day." The morning of November 24th, 1853, arrived cold and clear. Ruth woke before dawn, as always. She dressed carefully, braided her hair tightly, and walked to the big house, while stars still filled the sky. Today was the day. After 7 months of planning, gathering, preparing, today everything would change. The big house kitchen was massive, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway to prevent cooking fires from threatening the mansion. Cast-iron stoves, long preparation tables, cabinets full of dishes and serving-ware, pantries stocked with supplies. This was Ruth's domain, and today it would become her battlefield. She began with the turkeys, 2 massive birds, 20 pounds each, killed and plucked the day before. Ruth prepared them methodically, removing organs, rinsing cavities, preparing the oyster stuffing that Mistress Constance insisted upon. The stuffing mixture included cornbread, oysters brought up from the Gulf, onions, celery, butter, and sage. Ruth added something else. Finely ground oleander leaf powder, mixed so thoroughly with the sage that no one could distinguish the herbs. Each bird would absorb the poison as it roasted, the heat spreading the toxin throughout the meat. The basting liquid was next. Butter, bourbon, herbs, and a generous addition of concentrated pokeweed juice. The dark liquid looked identical to the bourbon butter mixture she'd made 100 times before. Every half hour as the turkeys roasted, Ruth would baste them, ensuring the poison penetrated deep. While the turkeys cooked, Ruth prepared the ham. A massive 17-pound ham, already smoked and salted, needed only glazing and roasting. The glaze was simple: molasses, brown sugar, and mustard. Ruth added pulverized castor beans, ground so fine they were invisible in the thick, dark mixture. She painted the ham generously, letting the glaze caramelize in the oven's heat, creating a beautiful, deadly crust. Aunt Dinah arrived mid-morning as planned. "Need help with all this?" she asked loudly, making sure anyone who might be listening knew that Ruth wasn't alone. "Yes, ma'am, thank you," Ruth replied. "So much to do." Together they prepared the side dishes. Sweet potatoes baked with molasses and butter. Ruth added foxglove powder to the molasses, stirring until dissolved. Corn pudding rich with eggs and cream. More foxglove powder, enough to ensure cardiac complications. Collard greens cooked with salt pork. Pokeweed extract added to the cooking liquid, undetectable in the rich, dark pot liquor. The pies came next. Pumpkin, pecan, and sweet potato, 3 of each. Mistress Constance's recipes followed exactly, except for Ruth's additions. Pumpkin pies got ground castor beans mixed with the cinnamon. Pecan pies got oleander powder mixed with the vanilla. Sweet potato pies got a combination: water hemlock powder in the filling, foxglove in the topping. "You making enough food to feed an army," Dinah observed, playing her role perfectly. "All these fancy white folks gonna eat themselves sick." "That's what they always do," Ruth said. Truer words had never been spoken. By noon, the kitchen was an inferno of heat and smells. The turkeys were browning perfectly, the ham was glazed and gorgeous, the side dishes were prepared, the pies were cooling. Ruth moved through the chaos with absolute focus, double-checking every dish, ensuring every poison was properly distributed, confirming that nothing had been forgotten. Edmund came to the kitchen around 1 o'clock, sampling food as he always did before a party. "That turkey smells perfect," he said, tearing off a piece of crispy skin. Ruth watched him eat it, watched him chew and swallow, and felt nothing. No satisfaction yet, just cold calculation. That single piece wouldn't kill him. She'd been careful to reserve the most heavily poisoned portions for the formal dinner, but it was a promise of what was coming. "Make sure the wine is properly chilled," Edmund ordered. Father wants everything perfect tonight. These are important people. Yes, sir, Ruth said. The wine. Ruth had already prepared the wine. 3 bottles of expensive red from the Colonel's personal collection, uncorked to breathe, Digitalis powder added to each bottle in carefully measured doses. 1 glass might cause irregular heartbeat. 2 glasses would cause serious cardiac distress. 3 glasses would likely be fatal. Guests began arriving around 4 o'clock. Ruth could hear their voices, their laughter, the sounds of horses and carriages in the front drive. Plantation owners and their wives, dressed in their finest, here to celebrate abundance and success built on the backs of enslaved labor. Here to eat food prepared by hands they'd never thanked. Here to die. At 6 o'clock, dinner was announced. The dining room table had been extended to its full length, set with fine china and silver, crystal glasses catching lamplight. Ruth and 2 other house slaves served the meal, moving silently around the table, placing dishes, pouring wine, becoming invisible as trained. The guests loaded their plates enthusiastically. The turkeys were carved, revealing moist meat and savory stuffing. The ham glistened under its glaze. The side dishes steamed. Compliments flowed as readily as the wine. "Ruth, you've outdone yourself," Mistress Constance said, a rare compliment that came only when she needed to show off in front of guests. "This turkey is exceptional." "Thank you, Mum," Ruth said quietly, refilling wine glasses. She caught Aunt Dinah's eye across the room. The old woman's face was carefully neutral, but her eyes held grim satisfaction. Colonel Beaumont stood, raising his glass. "To prosperity," he declared. "To cotton at 18 cents a pound. To Texas joining the Union as a slave state. To the continuance of our way of life. To our families, our plantations, and the labor that makes it all possible." "Hear, hear," the guests chorused, raising their wine glasses, drinking deeply of the poisoned vintage. Ruth refilled glasses as they emptied. The conversation flowed, talk of politics, cotton prices, slaves who'd run and been caught, breeding programs, crops and weather and money. They ate enthusiastically, going back for seconds, thirds, complimenting every dish, consuming Ruth's revenge with every bite. Dessert was served around 8 o'clock. The pies were cut, distributed, devoured. More wine was poured. Bourbon appeared for the men, coffee for the ladies, prepared exactly as they liked it, Ruth having ensured the coffee itself was also poisoned as a final guarantee. By 9 o'clock, the first symptoms appeared. Mr. Henderson complained of stomach cramping, dismissed it as overeating, continued drinking. Mrs. Blackwood mentioned feeling dizzy, attributed it to the wine. Edmund excused himself to the veranda, returning moments later wiping his mouth, having vomited, but not yet understanding why. By 9:30, the dinner party was collapsing. Mr. Caldwell was sweating profusely, pulse racing from the digitalis, attacking his heart. Mr. Thornton vomited suddenly at the table, shocking the others. Mrs. Henderson began shaking uncontrollably, the water hemlock's neurotoxin beginning its work. Mr. Whitfield clutched his chest, feeling his heart spasm. "Something's wrong," Colonel Beaumont said, standing unsteadily. "Something's very wrong." A chaos erupted. People ran for doors, for buckets, for help. Edmund tried to reach the front door and collapsed halfway there, convulsing. Mistress Constance screamed for Ruth, for medicine, for a doctor, but Ruth stood frozen in the dining room doorway, watching as the people who'd owned her, who'd violated her, who'd destroyed her children's innocence, writhed and suffered and died. The pokerweed caused violent vomiting and diarrhea, emptying bodies of fluid, sending people into shock. The digitalis caused hearts to beat irregularly, then too fast, then not at all. The water hemlock caused seizures, muscles contracting so violently that bones broke. The oleander caused respiratory failure, lungs simply stopping. The castor beans caused internal hemorrhaging, people bleeding from every orifice. It took 6 hours for all of them to die. 6 hours of agony, of panic, of desperate attempts to find help that wouldn't come in time. The nearest doctor was 10 miles away. By the time someone rode for him, half the guests were already dead. When he finally arrived after midnight, he could do nothing but witness the carnage. 9 people died that night. Colonel Beaumont, face purple, foam at his lips, died clutching his chest around 10:30. Edmund lasted until 11, his body racked with seizures, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. Mistress Constance died around midnight, her heart giving out suddenly. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson died within minutes of each other, their bodies simultaneously shutting down. Mr. Whitfield, Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Thornton and Mrs. Blackwood all died before dawn. The survivors, Mr. Blackwood, 2 other guests who'd eaten sparingly, and the household servants, were left traumatized, terrified, unable to explain what had happened. The doctor examined the bodies, examined the remaining food, and concluded it was poisoning, but couldn't identify the specific toxin. Too many symptoms, too many variations, too much chaos. Ruth was interrogated immediately, but she had her alibi. Aunt Dinah swore Ruth had never been alone with the food. 2 other enslaved women confirmed the same. Ruth herself maintained perfect composure, answering questions with simple honesty about the preparation, showing investigators the pantries and ingredients, demonstrating that nothing unusual had been used. "I cook the same meal I cook every Thanksgiving," Ruth said steadily. "Same recipes Mistress Constance gave me, same ingredients from the same suppliers. I don't understand what happened." And the terrible truth was, investigators couldn't prove otherwise. The food had been destroyed, eaten or thrown away in the panic. The symptoms were so varied that pinpointing a source was impossible. And Ruth's demeanor, quiet, submissive, seemingly devastated by the loss of the people who'd owned her, gave no indication of guilt. But Ruth wasn't finished. The Thanksgiving massacre was only the beginning of the terror campaign she'd planned. Over the next 6 months, Ruth and her network of enslaved women would continue their work, targeting the men who'd participated in or enabled the system that had destroyed so many lives. In December, the new overseer hired to replace McAllister drowned in the creek. His body was found 3 days later, lungs full of water, no signs of struggle. Investigation concluded he'd fallen in drunk, hit his head and drowned. But Ruth knew better. She'd waited until he was alone, checking the property boundaries, and simply pushed him into the deep water at the creek's bend, holding him under with a wooden plank until his struggles stopped. The colonel's younger brother, Josiah Beaumont, arrived from Charleston to take over the plantation. He lasted 6 weeks. On January 12th, he stepped on what appeared to be a rotten board in the barn loft, plunged 15 feet to the barn floor below, and broke his neck instantly. The board had been deliberately weakened over several days, cut almost through, and then covered with dirt to hide the saw marks. Ruth had studied his route through the barn, calculated exactly where he'd step, and prepared the trap perfectly. In late January, 3 plantation owners from neighboring properties died within a week of each other. All 3 were known for their brutality toward enslaved women. All 3 died in their own homes, poisoned by meals prepared by their own enslaved cooks, women Ruth had recruited. The methods varied. One died from tainted coffee, one from poisoned meat, one from contaminated medicine, but the message was consistent. The white men of Brazos County were no longer safe in their own homes. February brought fire. 3 barns burned, always at midnight, always starting from multiple points simultaneously, always impossible to contain. The fires destroyed equipment, killed livestock, and sent clear messages that enslaved people could strike anywhere, anytime. Ruth hadn't set these fires herself. She'd taught others how, shared her mother's knowledge, empowered women across 5 plantations to act. March saw 2 more deaths. A slave trader passing through Brazos County was found in his room at the local inn, dead in his bed. foam crusted around his mouth and nose. Examination revealed poison, but the inn's owner, a white man, was investigated, not the enslaved man who'd brought the traders dinner. Ruth had coordinated this death carefully, reaching out through her network to women in the town itself, proving that the resistance extended beyond plantations into every corner of white society. The other March death was particularly satisfying. A white investigator, brought in from Houston specifically to solve the poisoning cases, was found suffocated in his bed at the plantation where he was staying. His face was purple, his eyes bloodshot, his throat crushed as if something heavy had pressed on his neck for minutes. But his room had been locked from the inside. How could someone have entered, killed him, and left without breaking the lock? Ruth knew how. She taught a young enslaved woman who cleaned the rooms to wait until the investigator was deeply asleep, then place a heavy pillow over his face and press with all her weight until his struggling stopped. Lock the door again from inside, hide in the wardrobe until morning, and slip out when other servants entered to wake him. Simple, effective, terrifying to anyone who learned the details. By spring of 1854, Brazos County was in full panic. 14 white men had died in 6 months. Plantations were burning. Enslaved people whispered and smiled. White families locked their doors at night, avoided eating food prepared by enslaved cooks, fired and replaced domestic slaves repeatedly, searching for some combination of servants they could trust. But trust was impossible now. Ruth had demonstrated something fundamental. Enslaved people could kill their masters, not through open rebellion, which was always crushed brutally, but through intimate access to homes, food, medicine, the daily functions of life. White families couldn't survive without enslaved labor, but they couldn't trust that labor anymore either. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. Property values collapsed. Plantations that had been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were being sold for fractions of their value. White families were fleeing to Houston, to San Antonio, to anywhere that felt safer than Brazos County. New overseers wouldn't take positions there. Slave traders avoided the area. Insurance companies refused to underwrite properties there. Ruth watched it all unfold with cold satisfaction. She'd been interrogated 8 times, tortured twice, whipped until her back was shredded, trying to force a confession. But she'd endured it silently, never admitting anything, never giving up the names of her network. And remarkably, she was never sold away, never separated from her children, because by now the fear had become so pervasive that potential buyers wouldn't purchase slaves from Brazos County, believing them all to be contaminated with revolutionary ideas. Isaiah knew by now that Ruth was involved somehow. She'd finally told him, late one night in April, exactly what had happened in the barn a year before. She'd expected rage, grief, perhaps even rejection. Instead, he'd held her tightly and said, "Whatever you need to do, I'm with you. We survive this together or not at all." Her children knew too, in their way. Thomas, now 13, had grown hard and focused, already planning his own escape north once he was old enough. Sarah, 10, had become Ruth's shadow, learning everything her mother could teach her about plants, poisons, survival. Grace, 7, still bore the scars of what she'd witnessed, but she'd found her own strength, her own quiet resilience. By June 1854, Ruth had achieved something extraordinary. She'd transformed Brazos County from a prosperous cotton-growing region into a place of terror for white slaveholders. She'd proven that enslaved people could fight back effectively. That submission wasn't the only option, that the system of slavery created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those brave enough to try. The historical record shows that between 1853 and 1855, Brazos County, Texas, experienced an unexplained exodus of plantation owners. Property values collapsed. The enslaved population grew increasingly difficult to manage. according to white accounts. Violence against enslaved people decreased noticeably, not because of increased humanity, but because slaveholders were terrified of retaliation. Ruth Carter's name never appeared in official records as a revolutionary or resistance leader. She remained in white documentation simply Ruth House Slave, property of the Beaumont estate. But in the oral traditions of enslaved communities across Texas, her name became legendary. Ruth the Poisoner. Ruth the Fearless. The woman who made masters afraid. No one ever proved Ruth killed anyone. The evidence was circumstantial, the alibis were solid, and truthfully, investigators didn't want to find definitive proof. Because proving that an enslaved woman had orchestrated the deaths of 14 white men and gotten away with it would be admitting that the entire system of slavery was vulnerable in ways white society couldn't defend against. Better to call it a series of unfortunate accidents and mysterious illnesses. Better to move on and try to forget. Ruth lived until 1872, dying at 54 of natural causes, remarkable longevity for a woman who'd been enslaved. She survived to see slavery abolished, to see her children grow into free adults, to see Thomas become a teacher, Sarah a midwife, Grace a farmer with her own land. She survived to tell her story to her grandchildren, to ensure that what happened in Brazos County in 1853 was never forgotten. The legacy of Ruth Carter's resistance extended far beyond Brazos County. Stories of the poisonings spread through enslaved communities across the South, carried by traders, by sold slaves, by travelers, by the underground communication networks that whites never suspected existed. The stories varied in details but shared core truths. An enslaved woman had fought back, had won, had survived. If she could do it, maybe others could too. Historians debate the full scope of Ruth's network and actions. Some believe she was directly responsible for all 14 deaths. Others think she inspired copycat actions by enslaved women across the region. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Ruth certainly killed the 9 people at the Thanksgiving dinner. She almost certainly killed the overseer and the colonel's brother. The other deaths were probably a combination of her direct action and the actions of women she'd empowered and coordinated with. What's undeniable is the effect on white psychology in the region. The period from 1853 to 1855 saw a documented increase in white paranoia about domestic slaves across Texas. Laws were passed restricting enslaved people's access to certain herbs and plants. Plantation owners began requiring that white family members taste food before it was served. Some families went so far as to hire white cooks, though this was expensive and socially awkward in a culture where black labor was supposed to be sufficient for everything. The terror Ruth created also had an impact on the abolitionist movement. When reports of the Brazos County deaths reached northern newspapers, they were framed as evidence of slavery's inherent instability. How can the South maintain a system, one Boston editorial asked, where they must fear the very people who cook their food and tend their children? This is not stability. This is a powder keg. For enslaved communities, Ruth's story became a source of hope and inspiration. It proved that resistance was possible even from the most powerless position. It showed that intelligence, patience, and knowledge could be weapons more effective than physical strength. It demonstrated that women, especially women, had power that slaveholders underestimated at their peril. The night before Ruth died in 1872, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the small house she owned in Freedom, she shared her final thoughts about what had happened almost 20 years earlier. "What I did," she said slowly, her voice still strong despite her failing body, "I don't regret. Not one death, not one moment. Those men raped me in front of my children. They thought they could do that and face no consequences. They were wrong." "But Mama," Thomas said gently, He was 43 now, a respected teacher in the free black community. Did all those people deserve to die? Even the ones who weren't there in the barn? They upheld the system, Ruth said firmly. They owned human beings. They profited from slavery. They participated in evil. Were some worse than others? Yes, but all were guilty. And more importantly, their deaths served a purpose. They created fear. They proved that we could fight back. They saved other women from what was done to me. Did you ever feel guilty? Sarah asked. She was 38, a midwife who'd delivered over 300 babies into freedom. No, Ruth said simply. I felt many things: fear, satisfaction, determination, exhaustion, but never guilt. You can't be guilty for defending yourself and your children. You can't be guilty for fighting evil with the only weapons you have. Grace, 35 and usually quiet, spoke up. I remember that day in the barn, Mama. I remember what you went through, and I remember Thanksgiving night. I remember the screams. Both were terrible, but one was justice and one was evil. I've never confused the two. Ruth smiled at her youngest daughter. That's exactly right, baby. What they did to me was evil. What I did to them was justice. And I sleep peacefully every night because I know the difference. She died the next morning, peacefully, in her own bed, in her own home, as a free woman. Her children buried her in the small cemetery outside town, and they carved into her headstone not just her name and dates, but a single sentence she'd requested. She was property. She made them pay. She died free. Real? The story of Ruth Carter challenges us to think deeply about resistance, justice, and morality in the context of absolute evil. The system of slavery was so fundamentally wrong, so thoroughly evil, that normal ethical frameworks collapse when applied to it. Can we judge enslaved people for using violence against their oppressors? Can we apply standards of proportionality and due process to situations where no legal recourse existed? Can we condemn the killing of slaveholders while acknowledging that slavery itself was a daily horror far worse than any revenge could be? Ruth Carter didn't have the luxury of waiting for legal justice. She didn't have access to courts, to police, to any system that acknowledged her humanity. She was property, defined by law as a thing rather than a person. When the colonel raped her in front of her children, there was no authority she could appeal to, no justice she could seek, no protection available. So she created her own justice, using her intelligence, her knowledge, her access, and her absolute commitment to ensuring her children would never again be victimized the way she'd been. She didn't kill in a moment of rage. That would have been understandable, but ultimately futile. She killed strategically, methodically, over months, creating maximum impact with minimum risk to herself and her children, and she won. By any objective measure, Ruth Carter won. She survived. Her children survived and eventually gained freedom. The men who'd violated her died in agony. The system of slavery in Brazos County was destabilized. Other enslaved women were inspired to resist. Fear replaced complacency among slaveholders. One woman, starting from the most powerless position imaginable, achieved all of this. The question we're left with is not whether Ruth's actions were morally justified. They were. The question is why her story, and stories like it, have been erased from American history. Why do we know the names of white historical figures, politicians, generals, plantation owners, but not the names of enslaved people who fought back? Why are stories of docile, forgiving enslaved people uplifted while stories of violent resistance are buried? The answer is uncomfortable, because stories like Ruth's threaten the narrative that oppressed people should respond to oppression with patience, forgiveness, and non-violence. They challenge the idea that change comes through appealing to the better nature of oppressors. They prove that sometimes the oppressed must take freedom by force, because it will never be given voluntarily. Ruth Carter understood something that many comfortable people prefer not to acknowledge. Power rarely concedes without struggle. The slaveholders of Brazos County didn't free their slaves out of moral enlightenment. They fled in terror because enslaved people had proven they could kill them. That terror, multiplied across the South, was part of what eventually made slavery untenable. The system couldn't survive if white families had to fear the people cooking their food, nursing their children, working in their fields. This is Ruth Carter's legacy, proof that resistance is possible even from powerlessness, that knowledge can be a weapon, that patience and planning can achieve what momentary rage cannot, that women's work, cooking, cleaning, nursing, can become instruments of revolution, that love for one's children can inspire the courage to risk everything. Her story deserves to be told not as aberration, but as inspiration, not as cautionary tale, but as truth. Ruth Carter was not a monster. She was a mother who protected her children the only way she could. She was an enslaved woman who refused to accept that her body and her children's bodies were anyone's property. She was a human being who demanded dignity, and when it was denied, took it by force. If you're angry after hearing this story, your anger is justified. This was real. This happened. And it happened to millions of people across generations. The specific details of Ruth Carter's life may be constructed from historical fragments and oral traditions, but the essential truth is undeniable. Enslaved women were raped, their children were violated, their families were destroyed, and some of them fought back. If you're uncomfortable with celebrating Ruth's violence, sit with that discomfort. Ask yourself why you can acknowledge the horrors of slavery in abstract terms, but balk at celebrating concrete resistance to those horrors. Ask yourself if your discomfort comes from genuine moral concern or from an unexamined assumption that oppressed people should respond to oppression peacefully. The reality is that slavery was violence. Every moment of it was violence. The captures, the Middle Passage, the sales, the forced labor, the whippings, the rapes, the family separations, the denial of humanity. Ruth Carter didn't introduce violence to the situation. She redirected violence that had been aimed at her back toward its sources. We tell this story not to glorify killing, but to honor resistance. To acknowledge that enslaved people weren't passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation. To recognize that women, especially, fought back using weapons that patriarchy didn't recognize as dangerous until too late. To preserve memory of those who said no more and meant it. Ruth Carter said no more, and Brazos County, Texas, was never the same. If this story affected you, if it made you think, if it challenged your understanding of American history, leave your thoughts in the comments. Did Ruth do the right thing? Was this justice or murder? What would you have done in her position? And most importantly, why don't we learn these stories in school? Share this video if you believe these histories deserve to be told. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of resistance that textbooks won't teach you. Hit the notification bell because the next story is about an enslaved blacksmith who turned his chains into weapons. These stories matter. This history matters. We don't tell it to promote violence. We tell it to honor truth. Remember Ruth Carter. Remember that she was property who made her owners pay. Remember that she died free. And remember that freedom for those born in chains was never given. It was always taken.